Oh, wait a minute. I've got to press got it somehow. Wait a minute. How do I do that? Okay, got it. Yes. I'm slightly nervous because my thesis is that okay. Yeah, my thesis is that where most of us, most of the time, are in denial about the nature of the personal. So what I'm going to say is predictably going to be denied by the listeners, which it makes it sort of challenging to talk about it. And just to give you a little background to talking about it, many years ago, there was a study of human well-being by 2 doctors in England, and they surveyed a very large population of people, and they found that only 10% of them had no detectable disorders. 90% of them had detectable disorders. So they were sick. 90% of them were sick. 20% of those 90 knew they were sick. The rest didn't know they were sick. And they were in a compensatory state. They got up in the morning and they took a Valium, and they've been doing that for years, and they thought that was just the normal thing to do. It's not everybody who uses Valium, but we all take various things or do various things to compensate for our distressed state, which so wellness is not just physical, it's mental as well as physical. And I think the psychiatrist R.D. Laing put it best. He's in looking at people, he said what he sees people as if they've been hypnotized twice. Firstly, into accepting pseudo-reality as reality, and secondly, into believing they haven't been hypnotized. And so we're constantly being barraged with stuff that is coming from that, what I'll explain in a minute, an adapted self. And so we're constantly being brainwashed into thinking in that sort of adaptive, compensatory way of living our lives. So to backtrack from that to now, I worked as a psychotherapist as well as an ecologist. I actually did the first whole ecosystem study by an individual back in the mid-60s. And I was also a psychotherapist for many years, including being a psychotherapist for a royal family, which will give you some idea of the level of competence I achieved. My take is that psychologically, we're made up of 2 types of self. We have what I call a core self, and we've got numerous adaptive selves, which we've had to set up to survive traumas and stresses and all those sort of things. One a trauma that most people just brush over is that, for example, in an Aboriginal person giving birth, it takes about 20 minutes from beginning to end. Like an undeveloped Aboriginal person, a birth is about a 20-minute experience. The average birth for a Westerner or an industrialized person in our culture is 7 hours. So we're all born traumatized. We were designed for a 20-minute experience, but we were subjected to a 7-hour experience. And so we were born not being sure whether we were going to survive at a tissue level. So that's an amazing trauma that all of us have had to find a way to continue with. So my take is we've got a core self, and the core self is spontaneous, lives in the present, fully connected to the environment, is fully empowered, fully aware, clear about our values and our actions, and and able to love. Our adaptive selves, and we've got many of these, are the opposite of there. They exhibit pattern behaviors, which we see classically if you just watch the Houses of Parliament or government bodies or any committee meeting. We see constantly demonstrations of pattern behaviors. The other characteristics that are opposite are disempowered, unaware, oh, sorry, I didn't notice, compromised and confused values and actions, and fearful. And fearful is how most people function most of the time, but we're also in denial about being fearful. And so that's the double hypnosis of R.D. Laing. As a therapist, I was a very successful therapist because I only communicated between my core self and the core self of my clients. Most therapy doesn't work because the therapist, even if they're trying to communicate from their core self, they tend to communicate with the adapted selves of the clients. And so they come up with accommodating therapies for people so that they can carry on living in a screwed up world rather than actually working together to change it. That self is a relational self. So often people say they send children to school to socialize them, or they do things to socialize their children. We don't need to be socialized. We are a social species. We need to be enabled to express and develop our social potential, which is a different thing than being socialized. At every moment, my experience is everyone is doing the very best they can, given three things that interact with this. One is our genetics. And so, you know, if you're born without legs, you're not going to be able to run. So genetics have an effect. Mostly we're affected by our past experiences and adaptations to them, which is that links to our multiple adaptive selves, compensatory selves. And the third thing that determines the actions in the present is the relationship of the present environment. And so if it's an environment in which you've got to behave a certain way to stay employed or to be accepted by your colleagues and so forth, you behave in that way to avoid losing your job. All of those things that I've just spoken about need to be taken into account in fully understanding the nature of identity. And so most literature on identity is related to adaptive approaches to identity, not to core approaches. In that, one of the characteristics of being fully, so I've got how much? 1 minute. One of the characteristics of being fully in your core self is in relation to leadership. And so a core self is able to be an anonymous leader. That is a person who works in a leadership approach that involves a lot of people so that there's no single heroes over a long time frame using indirect strategies. You can come back to me on this, but I have several strategies for how do we connect with our core self. One of them is to go with your first thought. And so, for example, if I was, or what you've denied. So if you say, what are the three most important things related to understanding identity, and you write those down, if I said to you, if you could add a fourth, what would the fourth be? Always the fourth is the important one. The other three are the three that the adaptive self says, just to satisfy it, it's okay. My last strategy, and you can have to ask me about this, is paradoxically, the most powerful way to connect with our core self is by lying about what it's able to do or what it's done. Paradoxically, because it's lying, there's no role for any censoring by adaptive selves. Whereas if you say, what would you like to do? Everything you say you would like to do gets subconsciously censored by adaptive selves changing what you were thinking.
Thank you, Stu.
That's heavy duty stuff.
No, it's not. It was light breeze. There was a light breeze on a Thursday afternoon, and the reason there is the simple reason, which the heavy duty veracity is truth, trust, and authenticity. Is with the challenge we've given ourselves is quite a big one when we're dealing with identity and the digital space within that and the expressions of that. Which, Ben, I'm going to hand over to you. You can quick introduction and just kick it off as you please. You're co-hosted, Ben, so do what you need to do, mate. Thank you.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, kia ora koutou. I'm going to do a disclaimer. I don't do many presentations simply because they take so much time to do them well. And that's is evident in my preparation for this. I thought, oh yeah, cool. I'll set aside the most of this evening. For me, it's getting a little bit late here. I'm currently in Colombia. I'll set aside the evening and I'll put together the presentation, and I've got about halfway through it. So it's going to be fairly decent for a little bit, and then it'll fall off a bit. So if you can't tell, I'm buying time. Let me get us started though. Okay, I need to present a view and share screen. Okay, how are we? Is that looking about right? Looks good. Okay then. All right, so yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit about kind of from my perspective. I wanted to talk about how identity is related to trust, and I think the big thing is specifically from at least within the work that I do, and this is a narrative that comes from Te Ao Māori, and really around who has the authority around trust, right? Because we can't. In the end, when it comes down to it, we need to be able to prove who we are, and this is what it comes down to. And so you can't just believe that I am who I say I am, or that I know what I know, or I can do all these amazing things. So we need some element to be able to prove that. And what's happened is we've kind of seen this default fall to the crown, right, or the government services, or people that have been keeping these ledgers and records as these sources of authority around identity. And so I wanted to kind of dig into that a little bit. And the way I wanted to do it was actually just by having a bit of an exploration around, well, what does that kind of look like for us today? Let's go next. So Kwaio, who am I? This is always an interesting question for me, and this is really the basis of what we're talking about when it comes to identity. Kind of Brendan mentioned it, right? The way I answer that question really depends on who's the people who's asking and why. Like, what's the context going to be that's going to be relevant to you? And there's also a form of like how you're asking. If you wanted me to write up a transcript on who I am, you'll get a very different response to if you simply ask them. But for the purposes of this presentation and the information which is relevant is, well, my name is Ben Tairea. I'm currently the CEO and co-founder of Aho, which is in many ways a digital identity platform, although it takes digital identity from a very different perspective. And that was actually how I ended up being the Deputy Chair of Digital Identity New Zealand. And also, I'm also part of the Veracity, I'm an advisor on the Veracity Lab. But am I really any of these things? For the sake of this presentation, maybe that doesn't matter whether these things are true or not, but let's imagine for a minute that your life depended on this presentation and that information being correct. Well, maybe not your life, but maybe what about if you had like some business deal, or this is your professional career that really depended on the information that Ben Taidea was about to present as a source of authority around digital identity. And so what would you do? What would you do? Be like, well, I need to know, well, is that Ben, right? Is that really what he does? Well, maybe you might go back to the flyer that Brendan sent out and you'll say, okay, yeah, cool. It says here on Ben Taidea, and it says that he's CEO of AHO. It's got those same things. And so, well, now we have a source of corroboration, right? We now have Brendan who's corroborated this information for you. And so is that good enough for you? Are you happy to risk your career or your life, your business on this information if it was that necessary? Or is this just information that Brendan added to the slideshow, to the flyer, and because I asked him to? And actually, the truth is, I did just ask Brendan to do this. So maybe Brendan's starting to sweat a little bit around this. And maybe it wasn't true. Maybe it's not. But this is one of the ways in which we try to verify information that we've been given about somebody's identity. And in New Zealand, this is a particularly common scenario because we have this 2 degrees of separation. If somebody says, hey, do you know this person? Oh, yeah, I know that person. Good person, bad person. What do they like? What do they know? Are they, can they be trusted? All those sorts of things. In New Zealand, I mean, it's fairly small country. It's a particularly relevant source of authority, this corroborative source, but perhaps not enough to gamble our business on. So what do we do next? Well, we go to Google, don't we? And we put in Ben Taidea, this is his name. And we've got some links, so we can pretty well assume that Ben Taidea is a person. There's some photos here, but wait a minute. Is that Ben Taidea? Is that what he actually looks like? According to Google and a LinkedIn profile, that's what Ben Taidea looks like. So maybe I'm not even Ben. Maybe this isn't who I am. And so you take it a little step further. You click on the profile. Wait, actually, no, that is Ben. I'm pretty sure it's Ben now because now I'm seeing a photo that matches the person that I'm talking to. And so you start to feel a little bit reassured by that. And you start to say, okay, cool. You could scroll down and you could check some of the information. You could see, yeah, I've also got making the same claims about the work or the stuff that I'm involved in and the work that I'm a part of. So I'm making some claims and I also have a corroborated source. Now, this corroborated source is LinkedIn. And how did LinkedIn do any background checks on that? Can anybody create an account? Could I have just created an account called Ben Taidea and put in a bunch of information that I wanted to, and now I'm the source of truth on digital identity? Well, possibly, couldn't I? So what do we do? How do we know the difference between a fake profile and a real profile? We now fall back to connections, right? Like when we're doing this, especially on LinkedIn and particularly on Facebook, we looked at these connections. And so we've now fallen back to the age-old time of strength in numbers, or safety in numbers, for that fact. And no matter matters to us whether LinkedIn did any background checks or whether this profile is real or not. All that matters to us is that actually Ben's managed to convince 500 people that this is Ben, and these are the credentials that he has, and this is the work that he does. And so we seem to rely on the knowledge, the collective knowledge or the collective trust of everybody else around us. And so we have this kind of social reputation that has enabled to establish trust. And so I do this a lot on Facebook, right? Like if I get and how do we feel like these fake friend requests? You get a friend request from somebody that only has like 50 friends. And you're like, no, there's no way that's a real person. That's somebody that's only managed to fool 50 people. And so the truth is you're not a real person unless you've managed to fool over a certain number of people that we feel is the right amount of number for us to go, oh yeah, that's probably the person. They probably just don't have that many friends. Maybe they've only got 100 friends or something along those lines. But it's interesting, the social interaction around how we determine trust and identity and who's real and what they say is real within these social interactions. So you've now got a profile of Ben with 500 connections. Is this enough for you to bank your business on it? Are you now willing to say, yeah, I now believe that this is Ben and this is the role that he has? Perhaps, maybe not. So you go back to Google and you say, okay, hold on. I want to do a different search this time. I'm going to search Ben Taidea and Digital Identity Council. As long as I think that's Ben, it's probably Ben, but is he really on the council? Let's check that out. And so you go to the council and you find the first link comes up, Digital Identity New Zealand, our people. And so you click on this and you start to assess it. Is this a real website? Yeah, it looks pretty legit. These people look pretty legit. Like, I mean, if Ben's faking it, he's obviously put a lot of work into it. Oh, great, 1 more minute. Time's gone well. And so you can start to see, you then are starting to judge based on the content that you've been given around how true this is. And so what do we see? We can see, it looks legit. It's got the little safety lock. It's got the TCP/IP protocol. It's a secure website. So you know that it's being served from a particular location that's be trusted. So the website now has an identity, right? It's got an identity that we need to be trusted. It needs to be trusted. The organization, DINS, also has an identity and that needs to be trusted. And Ben Taidea has an identity that needs to be trusted. And that identity is made up of many different things, including my voice, this is what I actually look like. And those are the things that we've then put together to try to establish who Ben is. But businesses do this quite differently, right? They don't go and search LinkedIn. You know, when I open up a bank account and say, hey, it's Ben, I want to open up a bank account, they don't look at my LinkedIn profile, check my Facebook page. Although perhaps my employer does, and they look at that information. So, we've all seen, heard of cases where people have falsely misrepresented themselves. But businesses do it a little bit differently. They take physical documents and then they match them against the source of authority. And that works kind of well. But again, we are still dependent on these other sources of authority. And they aren't great sources, really, the information that's being claimed. Not everybody is born in a hospital, and that's particular with refugees and trying to match birth certificates. I remember when my dad telling me a story when he first migrated to Aotearoa, they asked him how old he was because there was no record. He got to choose his name, he got to choose his date of birth. And as long as once it was recorded into that ledger, recorded by DIA, that was the truth of it. His age and date of birth was whatever he declared it to be when he entered into the country. And so we have these interesting issues. But what if they could actually go to his mum and say, actually, what is his name? What is his date of birth? What did you name him? When was he born? Where was he born? Perhaps that's a more, could you imagine a more authoritative source than your mother around your date of birth or the way in which you were born or that story? So there's kind of just this exploration around, what does identity look like? Can we do it better? There's lots of different options. And I think, I had a bit of an exploration around some of the issues. I think there's lots of opportunities. 1 minute from here. Okay.
Yep.
So can we do it better? I think there's a lot of systems that are currently in design to be able to do this system better. And there's a statement here I quite like. There's an implicit shift from trusting those who own the media by which we transfer value, again, these claims and these sources of truth, to those with whom we are actually transacting. So is there a way in which Brendan can tell me who he is and that can be trusted, that I don't need to then do any other work and talk to any other people or go and corroborate that in any other way? Well, there's systems that can be developed that we can then use, and defining them as trustless systems, simply because the way in which you participate in the system actually removes trust. It doesn't allow for any you have to literally, you can't break the rules of trust. And so they call them trustless systems. And these systems have been designed with distributed ledgers, verifiable credentials, and decentralized identities. Aotearoa is moving into the space. We have the Digital Identity Service Trust Framework, which is enabling a lot of this infrastructure to be developed. It doesn't necessarily mean it'll be built. There'll be other, sources and people within the system that aren't a part of, that aren't doing distributed ledgers or verifiable credentials, but the infrastructure is there to enable it. And perhaps we can get to a system of self-sovereign identity, where I am the source of truth around my information, and anything you would like to know, I can tell you, and it can be trusted. That's me.
Excellent, Ben. Thank you so much for that. We're going to track right along across to Andrew. And just remember the chat room, everyone. If you've got questions, if things come up as people present, go into the chat room. Presenters can have a look at what's been asked of. Andrew, across to you, please.
Kia ora. Can you see me and can you see the slides?
Yes.
Right. I'm not sure why it's gone to that slide. Hang on a second. Right. Okay. Kia ora koutou. So first, a disclaimer from me. I am not an expert in digital identity, but I am very fascinated by the talks we've had from Stuart and from Ben. And I absolutely agree that it's about issues of power and trust, particularly into how we interact in society. And this first slide is a Twitter post from a few days ago by somebody that's pretty well known in New Zealand Twitter, who comments on disinformation and anti-vaxxer movements and right-wing extremism within New Zealand and the manipulation of social media in order to achieve political gain. And just in passing the other day, he did a post about setting up a new iPhone where it said Face ID, Apple's software for unlocking your phone and getting access to it, would not recognize his face anymore. Previously it had, but this new version of the software or this new phone had stopped recognizing him. And so that software was disempowering him. It did not verify his identity to enable him to access his device. So that's just one immediate thing that comes to mind when I think about systems of power and digital identity and verification, what it enables us to do. Here's a second one, which is related to one aspect of my identity, which is that I'm on the committee of a little NGO that got going a couple of years ago called Trust Democracy, which is interested in using deliberative democracy, not just relying on electing MPs and councillors. And we decided to set up a Give a Little page to allow people to donate koha to us to support the organization's work. And as part of that, I'm forced to go through the anti-money laundering and countering financing of terrorism hoops that were set up after 9/11 and which are still in place 20 years later. And actually what I found when I went in to do the verification of my identity, which of course was outsourced to a company in Australia, but I had to upload 2 webcam selfies and a driver's license and so on so that they could do the verification, was that Give a Little had retained a permanent history of my donations made via that site to other causes, which, if you're interested in somebody's political or social leanings, is gold dust, right? And you go, why is this information needed to be retained by this site for so long? And what does it mean about the agencies that could compel Give a Little to give it that information and what they can assess about my identity through those sources? But I am fundamentally, in my background, somebody who works on freedom of information or Official Information Act issues as they're known in New Zealand, or right to information as it's known in other countries. And this screenshot shows my profile page on an online platform here in New Zealand called fyi.org.nz that allows you to, enables you to make an OIA request online, and it will automatically publish the agency's responses. So it's a means of sharing the information that you get from a government agency by default, okay? And therefore, if somebody goes searching for me online, they may well turn up OIA requests that I've made in the past. Now, does the fact that I've chosen to give my full name inhibit some of my requesting activity? It might do. We've seen certainly people engaging in doxing and other tactics in order to try and discourage people from participating in political life. Here's somebody who's chosen just to give one name, right? Pretty hard to pin down who this person is. And I don't think that's any bad thing. And in particular, it's not a bad thing because some people have said to the person that runs the fyi.org.nz site, I need you to take down my OIA requests because I'm applying for a job with an agency that I've made an OIA request to in the past. And I know that they're probably going to do an online search for my name. And this is going to turn up that I've made OIA requests. That's seen as being, you know, troublemaking in our democracy. And you're going to go, well, that's pretty chilling effect that you're not feeling safe enough to express your political identity in what New Zealand would regard as a secure democracy, that you feel like you need to say, can you take down my request? Or can I make it with just one name? And this matters in New Zealand because under New Zealand's OIA, to be eligible to make a request, you have to be a New Zealander in or out of the country, or you have to be in New Zealand. And so sometimes you will see on this website agencies pushing back to requesters saying, we need to be sure of your identity. Now, the Ombudsman's been pretty clear that you don't actually have to be sure of a requester's identity, because if you weren't going to respond under the OIA, then he would just judge the reasonableness of an agency response under the Ombudsman Act. And in fact, many other countries don't require people making requests to be citizens or residents in that country. But applicant identity can matter also when it comes to a government agency consulting a third party. Let's say I make a request to a government department for a report that it's received from an industry lobby group, okay, which is pretty frequent because industry lobby groups seek to persuade government department of policy positions. The Digital Identity Forum that Ben belongs to is likely to have lobbied DIA on the drafting of the Digital Identity Trust Framework, and they may well have provided information and confidence to DIA that I, wearing another one of my identity hats as Deputy Chair of the New Zealand Council for Civil Liberties, may have wanted to see how did the industry shape government policy in the drafting of the bill. Okay, now the Ombudsman for many years has said that agencies should tell the third party who has made the request. But a few years ago, under advice from the Privacy Commissioner, the Ombudsman changed that line and said that if it's an individual seeking their information in a personal capacity, then agencies shouldn't tell the third party who's making the request. But if they are making the request as a group or somebody in a professional capacity like a journalist, there should be no reason why an agency cannot tell the third party who made the request. This may inform whether the third party has any objection to disclosure and help them to articulate the precise basis for their objection. Now, that's really problematic from my perspective, because reasons for withholding under a freedom of information law should be geared around the potential harm from disclosure, not who's making the request. And indeed, this is a point that's been made by the UK Information Tribunal in a case that went to appeal 2 years after the UK's law came into effect in 2007. And the Information Tribunal said, we wish to emphasise that the Freedom of Information Act is applicant and motive blind. A disclosure under the Act is a disclosure to the public, i.e. the world at large. And in dealing with a Freedom of Information Act request, there's no provision for the public authority to look at from whom the application has come, the merits of the application, or the purpose for which it is to be used. Now, both the UK Information Commissioner and the Ombudsman would caveat that by saying, but you need to look at the potential vexatious use of the Act and potential aggregation of costs. But it can be an issue. And that's why we see people using pseudonyms. And there was a case here 4 years ago where the Taxpayers Union used pseudonyms to seek information from Callaghan Innovation. And their justification for doing so was that they believed that they were receiving unfair treatment of their Freedom of Information Act request based on their identity as a requester. Okay. Now, the other reason that people may want to protect their identity is that in other countries, making Freedom of Information Act requests can get you. This is a screenshot of BBC's website from more than a decade ago, and already by that stage, you can see the number of people who had been killed for making Freedom of Information Act requests.
Andrew, 1 minute.
Yeah, thanks. And the same applies in Mexico. Numerous people have been killed in Mexico for making Freedom of Information Act requests, which is why the information commissioners there have built a platform that enables people to make anonymous or pseudonymous requests. And they can even pay any required fees, and still the process guarantees their anonymity. So that's why managing your identity in a democracy and in a public sphere can have significant impacts. And as a final thing, I'll say, earlier this year, Archives New Zealand overhauled how you search public records that it holds. It's our information, they're the custodians of it. And in revising their search interface, they now require people to use a RealMe login. So when we get to these distributed ledgers and who hold information about our interactions with different state services, my question then also is always, what gets appended to that identity information? Because you don't have to give your ID when you go into a library and browse the shelves. And I'm simply doing the online version of that with Archives New Zealand. And yet it now can be tied to my RealMe ID. Okay. In the same way that if I report lost property to the police, which I did a couple of years ago, they asked me for my driver's license number. Right. And you go, why do I need to provide a driver's license number for reporting some lost property? Okay. There's this obsession with matching information and verifying it, tying it to a real person, that this is why it highlights the issues of trust and confidence that DIA report on their web pages about digital identity. People have got real concerns about trust and power relations. So I'll leave it there. Thank you for allowing me to participate.
Wonderful. So what I'm going to ask now, everyone, is just for Ben. It's a chance for Andrew, Stuart, and Ben to unmute, and there might be some questions of each other before we open this up. So there's a chance, a few minutes, a few questions you might have of each other for clarification, or, you know, a chance just to, amongst yourselves, someone has said. Ben, you've unmuted. Is there any? So Stuart and Andrew, if you unmute.
Yep.
And it's a chance just to have a discussion amongst yourselves is a key question. And maybe to kick it off, in the chat room, Steve has asked a question, and it's to you, Stuart. I'll just wait for that one. But is there anything that Ben, Andrew, Stuart have said amongst yourselves that you want to clarify?
Well, I have a question in a sense, is sort of follows from what I was saying. Is my take is we have like a deep self, which I'm calling a core self, and we have an identity attached to that, and we have numerous adaptive selves, and we have identities attached to those. For me, listening to both Ben and Andrew, most of what's being collected and used by the systems is related to our superficial identities, our adaptive identities. Our core identity is mostly hidden. So for example, I would ask my students in relation to trust, when I was running workshops, we'd have a go around and I'd ask people to share something they'd never shared in a group ever before. And to do that, they took a risk, but that risk enabled trust and connection between core selves within a group. And just one last thing in relation to this, I use a term, an integrator indicator of who we actually are. So there are signs that give away who you really are. And I'll just give one very quick story. I was asked to run a workshop for facilitators, and I had to come up with a question for distinguishing between people who were facilitators, whether they were good at facilitating or not. And I asked them a question after a day of facilitating, were you able to go to a party and at that party not mention what happened during the day. That is an integrator indicator of a person who actually is able to facilitate, because to be able to go to a party and not talk about what happened during the day, they would able to be fully at the party. And to be a good facilitator, they needed to be fully at the facilitation. If you ask people to evaluate facilitators, they ask you all sorts of superficial things. Did they make eye-to-eye contact? Did they give everybody an opportunity to speak? And all those are trivial things. The question is, were they fully there? And that's an integrator indicator. And for me, what's really important in recording identity is recording integrator indicators of genuine core being identity, not superficial identity, because I couldn't give a shit which breakfast cereal I have and all the rest of it. Challenging stuff.
Yeah.
So what information are we giving away then, Stu? It's superficial. Does it matter?
Well,
Does it matter to you, Andrew?
all your consumption and waste production habits, you know, they're all like, if you make a brainstorm list of what your core being is able to do, think, understand, and do, they're just about opposite of all the things we spend doing, thinking and doing in our day-to-day living, because we're still stuck at a certain stage in our psychosocial evolution. Lloyd DeMause called that, we're living in the socializing phase of our psychosocial evolution, where one generation manipulates the next generation. The next step in our psychosocial evolution is enabling.
Right.
Is
I mean,
enabling the expression of our core selves, and that's yet to happen.
I think the points you're making, Stuart, are fundamental at a deep psychological level. One of the areas where I think for me, it's particularly interesting about this stage that we're at, if we're at a stage of evolution, is if I go back to the first slide that I showed of Te Rangikaiwhiria and Apple ID not recognizing him. I think from a Te Ao Māori perspective, you'd go, well, that moko on his face, that's not an adaptive expression of himself. Right? That's, the design of someone's moko is integral to their core self. And it's an outward expression of it. And yet, in that power relationship with, the world's biggest company, it's being negated by their technology. Right? Exactly. You've got something on your face. It's in the way of us identifying you. Right? Exactly. Now that's deeply affronting to a person's sense of identity. Right? Absolutely. And yet we're in a stage where we're having to adapt to the demands that the technology is putting on us. And that's just with their phone, right? But we know that, for example, Western countries, all their passport process is digitized. The face photo is digitized so that you can go through these smart gates at an airport and it does the automatic facial recognition. Well, this is the same core technology underneath this. Does that mean if you're Maori and you've got moko, the smart gate's not going to recognize you and allow you entry to your whenua, right?
Yeah.
That's a pretty offensive thing.
Absolutely.
Right?
Ben, you might want to kick in here.
Yeah, absolutely. And it comes down to like that core factor, right? It's the who's in control of this relationship between you and who you say you are, and who gets to determine that, right? And this is why, we now have, I think, what do they say, like Facebook or Google or something have something like, an average of 600 points on you about your identity. Like they probably have a better idea of your true or deeper self that Stuart's kind of mentioning than you have of your own self, right? Because of all of the information that's being collected by you online. And so, it's a really important point of, we need to think about systems in which we're designing for people to be able to define or declare their identity or make certain claims about themselves are inclusive of the systems that people use for identity. You know, of a pepeha, like how would my pepeha be relevant to this conversation, or how would that be relevant to a bank? And I walk into a bank and tell them who I am and where I'm from, and they go, cool, let's open you up an account. You know, that meets our AML and KYC requirements. Like, great to have you here. Like, the systems aren't designed for that, right? I have to have registered my birth certificate. I have to be able to present it. I have to be living at a particular address and be able to present that letter for you so that you can then show that I live in a particular place. Like, that's not relevant for a digital nomad. People, you know, we have a large percentage of the population now that just travel, and that's the way that they live their life. But I still can't get a bank account unless I can present an address. It's like, well, should I send it to the Airbnb that I'm going to next week? Or, you know, and then I'll you know, like, how does that align with society? I think, and some of the questions I think we need to be thinking about.
Thank you, Ben. Okay, and I know Steve's got a question he's wanted to ask, and it's quite a good segue across, because when I was running this, sort of setting this up, and Ben installed the idea for me, he said, you know, there's people online who identify themselves as a cat. And there we are, Steve's photo is of a cat. So over to you, Steve. And it's a good chance for you to introduce yourself to Andrew and Stuart and Colin, who may not know you. So we're in now to an open forum, everybody, for the last sort of 30 odd minutes. Steve.
Okay, thanks, Brendan. I'm part of the Veracity project, so Ben and Colin both know me, as do Tim and Matthias and you. Oh, and Stephen's here as well. And I'm at University of Waikato in Hamilton, Kirikiriroa. I actually wanted to ask a question which isn't the one I typed up, which was right at the beginning. I want to ask the question that follows on from what the three of you have just said, which is actually what all these organizations are interested in is not your identity. They want a way of finding you if you do something bad to them. That's actually what's going on, right? So they don't actually care who you are, in the sense of you know, who you really are. They just want to know where to find you if you defraud them, or you cheat on them in some way, or you do something that they consider bad to someone else. And of course, that's a whole other kind of worms, what they consider bad. So in a way, a lot of these big companies are doing stuff that is sort of beside the point, I think, as far as real identity is concerned. And this partly goes back to, I mean, what all of you were saying, which is, and Ben mentioned the sort of 2 degrees of separation, is that someone once said, who was accumulating information about people in a local sense, and someone asked them, why do people give you information? And the answer was, because I walk down the high street and they can see me, and if I did something wrong, then there I would be, and that stops me doing bad things. So, and I guess that is an aspect of what these big multinationals are trying to do online. So there do seem to be these two strands, which probably, you know, marries up with what Stuart's saying of different sorts of identity.
So I think there's 2 things that immediately spring to mind, Steve. The first is that I think big companies are, well, on one level, I think you're right, that it's a means of how do we track you down if something goes wrong. That is certainly one motivation for wanting to confirm things like address and so on. But Ben touched on another point earlier, which was about the number of items of information that, you know, Facebook or Google may have on individual people. And that goes to Professor Shoshana Zuboff's book about the age of surveillance capitalism that came out a few years ago. Because what you can do when you've got that amount of information at your fingertips is that you can shape the algorithm, which in turn shapes what you see online. And at that point, those companies are no longer interested in chasing after you if something's gone wrong. They're interested in shaping ontologically what you know about the world and how you interact with public life. And Amazon may do it in terms of shaping your purchase decisions on its side, but we can see from stuff around Facebook, Cambridge Analytica, and so on, that it is also used for manipulating voter behavior. So that's the second thing. And the third thing is that a lot of this identity verification inside government, and it's a small subset, I will grant you, but it is a valid and important subset to the state, is that if you go for a job within the public service that requires you access to material that's classified above a minimum level of restricted, you will have to go pretty severe vetting, right? And obviously the further up the level of classification you go to top secret, the more the developed vetting is and the more intrusive it is in terms of getting to who you are as a core person, because the state is fundamentally wanting to know, can we trust this person not to pass on secret information to somebody else, right? So at that point, it's no longer about finding you if something goes wrong. It's about them needing to know, can they place trust before they share information with you. So so I think your point's valid, but it goes beyond just that.
Yeah. I think that points out the diversity of that exists in this whole area. You know, it's like the old joke about, you know, the blind men touching the elephant and describing it. Is what you're interested in relates to your capabilities and your backgrounds and your agendas and all those sort of things. And so in terms of understanding this, the danger is to make assumptions about any of these issues. And so a really important part of the process of engagement is pausing, which most people forget to do. And it's what has saved my relationship is when my partner says something, you know, I quite often want to correct the statement or defend myself or explain another explanation. But if I pause, then there's a space for, I'm wondering what she's trying to say or what's going on for her. And then there's curiosity comes in instead of a defense. And so a question emerges rather than, I didn't say that. That's not what I think.
So Stu, what is society trying to say? So we're at a stage of evolution. You were talking before, and there is a collective. This is a global thing. It's not just us. And here we are with the global. You know, we've got Ben in Colombia, and we've got a diverse community here. What is, in your experience, what's trying to be expressed?
Well, I think multiple things. So it's not just one thing. So on one side of the coin is control. And the other side of the coin is curiosity and questions and you know, alternative visions for the future and hopes and dreams and all those sort of things. And under pressure, we switch from those wonderings to control, you know. Oh, wonderings is a bit too dangerous. We're better just nip back to control. And one of the things governments do instead of actually being open to possibilities is to initiate studies. And they say, oh, we're going to carry out a study. You know, it's like the endless study of climate change, which we actually knew about climate change back in the 70s, in in the 1970s, we actually knew about climate change. We've been postponing action on it by carrying out studies ever since. And I call that monitoring our extinction research.
People in the field call it predatory delay.
Yes, I like my expression better, I think.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
pausing, there's a value in pausing.
Yes, there is. And there were two other aspects about what's been happening in New Zealand that concern me. And this is where I sort of look at the work that I've done through being a member of the New Zealand Council for Civil Liberties, but I'm not here wearing that hat today. The council submitted on the Digital Trust Identity Framework Bill. And one of the things we said was that the board and the authority shouldn't be sitting inside a government department. They should be independent Crown entities, for example, right? If you want public trust in these processes, don't stick them in a government department. And the other thing we said was that they ought to be consulting far more. There are provisions in the law for consulting with Maori, and this is increasingly ways in which in new legislation, the Crown is honouring finally, or it's taking steps to honour its treaty obligations. But government practice around consulting other members of the public is way, way behind. And we don't see obligations placed on the Crown to consult with other members of the public who also have to engage with this framework. That then raises questions that I think are in many ways unjustified, and they betray a lack of understanding of the treaty. But it says to people, why are Maori getting special treatment? They've got defined consultation rights in this, and we don't. So the government can walk over all over our desire to participate in this process, but they can't walk over Maori desire. And you have to go, well, that's because they've been walking over Maori desires for 160 years, and perhaps it's time they stop doing that. And that's why we give specific protection to it in this bill, but it is a real issue for many of the rest of us. And we saw that again in the data and statistics bill that went through this year, that the council had strong views on, because increasing amounts of information are now put into a single repository, the integrated data infrastructure, where we are told de-identified, not anonymized, but de-identified data is available for social science researchers to slice and dice to do social science research. But there are real problems with the assurances that we're given with that and the powers that are available to agencies, because these powers are now can be shared with intelligence agencies and the police, and the minister and the government statistician is subject to direction by a minister for the use of those powers.
And to control, Matthias, I was just you've made a comment, but I'm interested in, from a Veracity Lab perspective, what you've heard, or is there a direction of inquiry you'd like to pursue?
Yeah, I mean, I had some comments or questions, but maybe just a higher level comment. I think, or maybe actually a higher level question back to the panelists. I mean, in the Veracity research, we look at different levels of trust and authenticity and truthfulness. And I mean, I think the discussion so far, they focused on the human aspects or the philosophical, I guess, view on identity, which actually for me raised the question, well, we can do a lot, we can develop a lot of technologies. I mean, there is blockchain around, other technologies, but will we actually ever be able to develop technologies that will resolve the trust issue at all? So, I mean, this was also something that came up when Stuart was talking about the types of identities, because, yeah, I mean, something like Real Me or something that links or identifies our true self is useful in some scenarios, but maybe in some other scenarios, we do not want to reveal our true self. And it's actually maybe even more useful to not reveal our true self and maybe not all the data about ourselves. So I was just wondering, what is the panel's view on this trade-off between what we can do, what we might do from a technology point of view versus what we should do from a human perspective, or from a maybe thinking in terms of technology users point of view? And will we ever be able to resolve it from a technology point of view? I guess that's my question. Or will we at some point have to accept, okay, identity is something that we may not be able to show completely in some scenarios, but it's not all bad, because in some contexts it may actually be useful not to reveal our full identity. So I'm just interested in this trade-off, because in the technology world there is a lot of discussion around that, especially in the context of blockchain. But on the other hand, well, maybe at some point we have to accept that we won't be able to build full solutions to the identity problem.
I have a bit of an answer, which is related to a resource constraint environment that we live in. If we've got limited resources, to use up those resources, communicating with adaptive selves is an enormous waste of resources. So even though there may be some risk in communicating our core self, actually in terms of the evolution, the psychosocial evolution of our society, that's what I want to be moving towards. So for example, I want to know about how a person acts from their loving self, loving core. I'm not interested really in having a long list of the ways they act from their fearful core. That's just a waste of attention and resources and energy. And so the question with some of those superficial selves, are they of any importance? They have an importance in that in some ways they're a window towards what your core self is. So whatever that superficial self that can be shared is, we need to ask the question, what is that superficial self in the service of? Now, if it says it's in the service of trying to take a step towards a loving and empowered, aware, active self, then that's one thing. If it's in the service of a fearful, patterned, disempowered, unaware self, it's a barrier to our psychosocial evolution. And I'm not interested in like people say, talking about the COVID thing, let's get back to normality. I don't want to get back to normality, because normality is shit. You know, I want to progress, use this as an opportunity to progress. You know, what's the small meaningful step that we can guarantee to take towards progressing out of shit into some nourishing environment?
So Stu, just a supplementary to that before I hand over to Andrew and Ben on that question. I mean, the Veracity team's being tasked to explore these issues. So as a team, how do we progress positively? Because there is technology to be developed. You know, you've got professors here with all sorts of digital science and computer science skills and expertise. Or not. You know, there's a chance of what we do could make things worse. So how do you ensure, if you're on a, you know, the tack you take, or, you know, if we're on a boat, the tact we take to actually change direction or address some of these issues? That's what I think Matthias was saying. What are some questions we should ask ourselves?
Well, but I love what Ben and you guys are trying to do. And if I was running a workshop with 1,000 Maori who are participating equitably in this process, I would actually do the exercise that I mentioned earlier. I'd have them write down 3 things that they would like to be recorded about themselves. And I would then get them to draw that as a triangle, with each of those 3 things as points in the triangle. I would then say, having had them do that, saying there's a relationship between those 3 things that they came up with. And what's really important is what those relationships are. But then I would ask them, if you could add a fourth thing, what would it be? And I guarantee you that fourth thing will be far more important than the three that they said first. And I would have them put that in the middle of their triangle and connect that up to the 3 points. And what's really would be interesting then is what is the relationship between that thing they put in the middle and those 3 points. And if I was prioritizing what I would want to record in the database, it would be the things that they came up with as their 4 things.
Mm.
So somehow we've got to start to find ways to distinguishing between superficial things. It's not that those 3 things aren't important, but they're actually not the most important for each individual. What is most important for each individual is the 4th thing they say. And that really needs to be heard and recognized and responded to. And when we respond to one of the 3 things they said first, we're actually keeping them distracted from their own journey towards the middle.
Mm.
You know, and so that's the bold steps we need to take in society, is to how do you enable moving towards the core stuff, the more important stuff, and not being distracted by the less important stuff.
Oh,
And it's each individual, it's going to be different.
Andrew and Ben, in response to all of that, what Matthias's point, and
Ben, after you.
yeah.
I think in response to Matthias's question, I think we are on a pathway to exploring what trustless systems look like. You know, they are being kind of developed in a way where to participate within the system, you can't be lying. And so I no longer need to trust, you know, certain claims that you're making, because it's the fact that you can make a particular claim, it's trusted in itself. And so I think that we know that technology also has a great impact on society and how society behaves. The more that it becomes harder and harder to tell a lie, the less people will lie, because the only way to lie is for it to be successful. And if it's super easy for something to be, you know, for it to be found out, then people stop lying about certain things. So I think there's kind of those 2 aspects of it. I don't know. I think there's dangers and I think Andrew brought up some really, really interesting points around what should be available, right? Like, you know, great if we had everything available, then okay, it'd be impossible for anybody to lie, but it'd also be particularly dangerous in an unsafe environment to be in. So we kind of, you know, that trustless, along with, you know, zero knowledge proof kind of combos. I think there is something really interesting to be explored, and moving down that path will perhaps have an impact on the societal culture around what actually information do we need to know. I really think that Stuart's onto something there around like getting down to the core of who the person is. Doesn't matter whether you pretend to be a cat. It doesn't matter whether your name is Brendan or Stuart or Ben. That's not the important thing. The important thing is can I trust you within this relationship that we're going to be working together on, or we're going to be doing something together on? And that getting to the core of that, I think, is all that needs to be asked. You know, I think Andrew brought up a really interesting point. We do have this insane addiction to write down everything, like forms. Like I'm so surprised, like the amount of information that we ask on certain forms. It's like, is this relevant to what I'm doing here? You know, it's just this, we want to collect data, we want to connect it, we want to be able to connect it all together. We have this addiction, I've got to connect it all together. And that's not relevant for the purposes in which service that we provide or the relationship that we're engaging in. So yeah, I think it's interesting.
And the most important thing, we may not actually be able to measure or even describe. Like I remember learning about agriculture from my grandfather, who was uneducated, and I was only 3. when he said, he came into the house and he said, today is the day we're going to plant the potatoes. And at 3, I said, why today, Gramps? And he took my hand and we walked outside and he looked at the sky and he said, whirr. And then he looked at the soil and he said, "Arr." And that was the answer.
Yeah, moving right along.
Lovely.
And he actually knew that today was the day and this is where we're going to plant them.
Yeah.
And so, you know, it's relates to what you're all saying. All the bits and pieces you can actually record and measure, like the things we can measure most accurately are the most irrelevant things. The really important things, like if you look at an amazing work of art, we don't know how to measure that.
But Stuart, I'll come back to Matthias' question, but you see, what's interesting to me is that you're talking about sharing stuff from our core self. And that's fine for me in the interpersonal relationships that I choose to have with people that I trust to receive that information. But if we're talking about it in the context of the Veracity Labs project of going, you know, to think about how can people trust the state, I don't actually want to share the core stuff about myself with the state. I only want it to know the relevant limited aspects of my expressed adaptive self that are relevant for that transaction.
But that's because the institution that you're being asked to share anything with is a fucked up institution.
Maybe, but sadly, I don't think we're going to get to utopia. So,
well, we've got to be moving towards a better collective.
Yeah.
I mean, like one of my students who is a Maori New Zealander, Dale Hunter, wrote a book on cooperacy, which is the next stage from democracy. Democracy is just 50+1. So it's all part of the shit, basically, democracy. But what we've actually got to get towards is cooperacy, is collaborative decision-making, not 50+1 decision-making. And so, I mean, another way to think about this is in relation to trust. You could make a list of people who you trust. If you then had to choose one of them who you would want to be stranded on a tropical island with, it comes down to one of those people. And a whole lot of them get eliminated. Now, what makes that individual the one that you would trust more than all the rest is what's really important to know in making decisions, not all the measures of trust and everything. It's actually, how do you get down to that were and are of making a decision?
I don't share that with anybody else, Stu. That's the Veracity Labs core secret.
I wanted to come back to some of the questions that Matthias was raising. So the first was you talking about varying levels of credential or trust. And for me, I'm yet to see an example where somebody doesn't automatically default to saying, well, I want the gold standard. Why would I want anything less, right? And if you say that there are tiers of trusted credential or points at which you can start to not worry about the trust, everyone will default for the highest level because, you know, they want to reduce risk. And this exists in a quite separate dimension about how do we measure and assess and respond to risk. So I just put that to one side. But the other thing that strikes me about this conversation is that we're having this conversation in New Zealand without a written constitution, without ID cards. With Stuart in Australia, does have a written constitution, no ID cards. He and I are Brits. We come from a country with no written constitution, no ID cards. And yet Matthias comes from Germany, where of course there are ID cards. And their history teaches them the dangers of the state gathering so much identity information about different aspects of us. And Ben's in Colombia, which will have a written constitution and ID cards, okay? And I'm pretty sure that this conversation will be completely off the wall to people in Germany or Colombia about their relationship between the state and identity compared to how we're having this conversation.
Right.
And for example, my wife is originally from Indonesia, okay? And in Indonesia, people have to have an ID card. And on your ID card, you have to choose one of the 5 designated religions, right? You can be Christian, Catholic, and it's interesting they draw that distinction, Christian, Catholic, Buddhist, Hindu, Muslim, right? You cannot choose atheist. And in fact, people have been prosecuted in Indonesia for saying, I'm atheist.
What about
Right?
animism?
Right? Well, I don't think even animism is a permitted religious category to have in your state-issued identity card, right? Now, it's difficult to go to something more to the core of somebody's self-identity than their religious belief, and yet there's the state limiting it to 5 possibilities.
Right.
Right?
As they do with gender.
Yeah. So I think, Matthias, you raise really important questions. I have no easy answers for you or the Veracity Lab. I just know this conversation will be completely different if it was in Germany or Italy or Indonesia.
That's a really good point, Andrew.
Yeah. Just a comment about the like trust. What level of trust would somebody aim for? And everybody would aim for the gold standard. Actually, I'm not entirely sure, because I think in the end it depends on, well, the effort or the resources required. Because if it requires a lot of resources to ensure the highest level of trust, for example, we need to collect and maintain a lot of data. Maybe I will actually opt for a lower level of trust if it's still, I mean, to me, trust is not binary. So maybe a lower level of trust is sufficient for a certain purpose. And I may not need to collect and maintain the same amount of data.
I agree that trade-off may be made, but I think it comes back to their risk tolerance.
Yep. Yeah,
right?
exactly.
And what's at stake.
So, yes, exactly. Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah.
And
I also agree.
everyone.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry,
okay.
Matthias, please go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just also, I agree with the discussion around that it heavily depends. I mean, trust, what it means, and what are people willing to share in order to, well, provide trust in, for example, somebody's identity. I think it's heavily cultural dependent. So yeah, I was just fully agreeing with Andrew's point here as well.
So can I just, Brendan, I know we're near the end. I just want to conduct a quick experiment with people on this call. Can you put your hand up if you have WhatsApp installed on your computer or your phone? Okay. How many of you got the consent of the people that are stored in your phone or computer's address book before signing up to WhatsApp? Right, none. Because the terms and conditions for WhatsApp mean that you agree to give Facebook all the contact information that's in your contact book on your device, right?
Yeah.
I'm supposed to trust somebody who, without my consent, has given all my contact details to Facebook when I've opted not to be on Facebook, right? So I'm just a parting gift for people to have a think about in terms of how we trust one another and what the companies require that we give up or actually undermine our trusted relationships in order to get a service from them.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Andrew. Hey, we're going to go reverse. So we'll go Andrew, Ben, Stuart, Matthias, then I'll close out. And so Ben, is there a closing comment from you?
I think my closing comment is I think it's identity is a really interesting field to explore when it comes to veracity and trust and truth. I think there's a lot of really important work, a lot of people really trying to dig deep into this, and a lot of advancements within technology space around it. So I think, yeah, it would be I just think there's a lot for Veracity Lab to dig into and to peel from that perspective, looking at how, what is the field of identity and how is it trying to solve this field of veracity as well. So yeah, that's my closing comments. I really appreciated the conversation. It was really interesting and so many, and just like really different contexts, and people come from really different areas, but that's identity, right? Like, this is what I love about identity, is that it is so encompassing of so many different things. So yeah, really awesome discussion. Thank you, everyone.
Kia ora, Ben. Stu.
The final sort of thought I have in my mind is the question, what is identity and trust in relationship to? And there are specifics related to that, and there are space frames and time frames. So if it's in the moment or into forever and ever, and locally or globally. And so that's an important thing to consider. The other thing that I have in mind is a guy called Voisin wrote a book called Soil, Grass and Cancer. And figure 1 in that book is a great big circle. And next to it, there's a dot. And under the dot, it says the sum total of human knowledge. The big circle is the rest. So most of what is unknown. And we are constantly making decisions on the basis of the dot. And people talk about evidence-based decision-making, which is making decisions on the basis of the dot. That involves cleverness and being able to measure things. To engage with the big circle, I have to go back to my grandfather's were and are, which is about experience and wisdom and intuition and all the things that I can't measure and can't describe. But that's what's the main things that enable me to make wise decisions. How I fell in love with my partner was not based on evidence-based decision-making or the dot. It was something else, et cetera, et cetera. So all the important things that I've ever engaged with have actually been the things that we haven't been able to measure. Ha ha!
Thanks, Stu. And Matthias.
Or Andrew, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I can go first. Well, I was just going to thank a few people, but I'm really happy.
I think Andrew, as a panel member, I think if you...
No, well, I've already had enough of a say. I was just going to respond to one of Stuart's points there about the and the R, and is a very good article. I've just pasted the link in the chat that was in the London Review of Books about 4 years ago, where a chap called Stefan Collini, who teaches at Cambridge, reviewed 2 books about metrics and our obsession with metrics. And he talks about how would you invent an app to measure whether your partner loved you, and how quickly people would start changing their behaviors to game the app's indicators to demonstrate that they were loving you. How many times would they bring you a cup of tea in bed in the morning? How often would they, tuck you in at night? All those kind of things. So I think if there's one thing to go and read after this webinar, it's go and read that Stefan Collini article in the London Review of Books.
Awesome. So look, my closing remarks is to thank everyone. And Camilla, thank you so much for hosting us at the background. Camilla, just in closing, is there anything as a PhD student in concluding that you've observed? Is there anything you'd like to, you're from Brazil, so we've got to have some more South American, got Ben over there, we can't let him. So is there anything that you've observed that you'd like to share?
Oh, no, I think that it was a very nice discussion, and it put me into reflection many times. So yeah, I was the woman in disguise.
Yes.
Yeah, I did make that note. So look, I just wanted to thank you, Stu, Andrew, and Ben, and perhaps for me, in the role that I have, I just want us not to lose this discussion. I don't want us to lose this discussion as we proceed onwards with the Veracity project, that we challenge ourselves to remind ourselves perhaps what that 4th question is that Stu talks of, the most important. And that may be unresolved. It may take us quite a long time to actually find that, but be, that correct persistence and persistent with that. So, because actually for me, I think these tools are a bit of a gift from the gods, but got to be careful how we use them and what comes with it. And so it's a great exploration and a great challenge for Veracity to hold this conversation. It's actually written in our contract to do this. So thank you so much. Let's keep it up. Matthias, over to you to close out.
No, I think, Brendan, you summarized it very well. So I think this discussion again emphasized or confirmed that we are trying to do in the Veracity project has a lot of relevance, and in particular that we don't only look at the technical solutions, but also look at the broader, I guess, socio-technical aspects of trust, identity, authenticity. And I mean, I like what I think it was Andrew, or was it Ben earlier, what in your introductory statement, I think one of you mentioned that identity is about power relations, and I think this was quite a nice nice way of expressing the importance or the meaning of identity. So yeah, it's essentially about power, and either it's the power of those who want to confirm their identity, or the power to those who want to not reveal their identity to protect themselves. So either way, you know, it's about power relations. So yeah, again, also thank you for joining us. I mean, we have actually, as part of the Veracity Lab's work, we also produce some white papers, let's say non-scientific research papers, but just where we try to explore different concepts. And one of the concepts we are working on is, well, trust. What is the meaning of trust? So you can expect to see on our website at some point some discussion of white papers on the topic. And yeah, there will be others also on other concepts as well, besides the actual scientific research we do. Yeah, so thanks again, and hope to see you in our future webinars.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.